Sebastian by Anne Bishop. Long ago, in a time that has faded from memory, a mother's tears forged the bridge that, ever after, connected the power of the living, ever-changing world to the human heart. Myth. Chapter 1. Present. Standing at the kitchen counter, Sebastian closed his eyes and inhaled slowly and deeply to savor the smell of freshly ground coffee beans. Better than a woman. At least a more sensual experience than the last two he'd been with. When an incubus found sex boring, it was time to take a break or think about another line of work. Pushing that thought into the mental trunk where he'd shoved so many unpleasant memories, he followed the rest of the instructions for brewing the coffee beans. What would it be like to rise in the first wisps of dawn and come out to the kitchen to grind the beans, while someone who truly mattered was snuggled in his bed, waiting to be awakened with a nuzzle and a kiss, and a cup of freshly brewed coffee? What would it be like to stand outside, cup in hand, and watch the day come alive? Sebastian shook his head. Why was he rubbing salt into emotional wounds, thinking about things that couldn't be? He lived in the den of iniquity, which consisted of a few blocks of crowded buildings and cobblestone streets, a place that, most likely, had been an unsavory part of some large city, nothing but a dark smudge in a daylight landscape. Then a landscaper had altered the world, turning those streets into a separate landscape, and that had changed the feel of living on those streets, had changed the taverns, gambling houses, and brothels into a carnal carnival. But it was more than a place where human vices were openly enjoyed, more than a place where humans who didn't fit into the daylight landscapes and demons like the incubi and succubi could live. The den was at the center of a cluster of dark landscapes, some of Ephemera's demon races claimed as their own. It was a place where those demons could purchase supplies or buy a drink in a tavern without being hated or driven away because they weren't human. It was also a place that had its roots in the darker side of the human heart, a place where the sun never rose. He'd been a bitter 15-year-old boy when he'd stumbled into the den. Having escaped his father's control 2 years before, he'd disappeared into the landscapes and struggled to survive. The dark human landscapes were too desperate and frightening even for a boy whose demon nature eclipsed whatever human blood might flow through his veins. But the people in the daylight landscapes didn't want something like him living among them, and he'd been driven out of village after village as soon as the people realized that he was an incubus, and that hunger for the emotions that were produced by sex was something that couldn't be hidden or denied for long. So when he found the den and felt the dark, edgy carnival tone of the place, he'd embraced it with all his heart, because he'd finally found a place where being an incubus didn't make him an outcast, a place where the never-ending night suited who and what he was, a place where he could belong. And he still belonged there. The den was his home. But now, as a man who had recently turned 30, I'm so tired of the night. A sudden yearning for something washed through him, making his heart ache, filling him with a need and a longing so powerful it staggered him. He braced his hands on the counter and waited for the feeling to pass. It always did. But the yearning had never been this powerful before, had never swept through him like this. Didn't matter. Those feelings came and went, and nothing changed. Disgusted with himself for not being content with what he had, he plucked a mug off the wooden stand and almost dropped it when someone knocked on the cottage's front door. He never brought anyone to his home, never invited anyone to visit. The only two people who ignored that demand for privacy were his human cousins, Gloriana and Lee, and neither of them would sound so hesitant about applying knuckles to wood. He'd just ignore it. That's what he'd do. He'd ignore it, and whatever was on the other side of the door would go away. The door creaked open. Sebastian's heart pumped against his chest, and he set the mug on the counter, careful to make no sound. Just as silently, he eased the biggest knife he had out of the woodblock. Maybe he wouldn't win, but he'd go down fighting. "Sebastian?" A voice called out. "Sebastian, you here?" He knew that voice, but he still hesitated. Then he swore silently and slipped the knife back into its slot. There were very few things in the den that couldn't be bought, but trust was one of them. Moving to the doorway that separated the kitchen from the main living area, he peered into the room and studied his visitor. The other incubus stood on the threshold, almost bouncing with nerves. Yet his eyes were bright with curiosity, and he looked at the simple furniture and the framed sketches on the walls. "What do you want, Teaser?" Sebastian asked. If Teaser noticed the harsh note in Sebastian's voice, he ignored it and bounded into the main room. Then he stopped, spun around, and closed the outer door before moving toward Bastian with the cocky swagger that was at odds with his boyish good looks. Women were often deceived into believing he acted the way he looked. With Teasers, sometimes that was a serious mistake. As youths, they had trolled the dense streets together, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Teaser projecting an image of a boy out for a bit of naughty fun, while Sebastian was the handsome piece of danger with his sable hair and sharp green eyes. They'd played their games of seduction, providing physical sex to women who crossed over to the den from the daylight landscapes, or using the power of the incubi to connect with another mind through the twilight of waking dreams, feeding on the emotions they've created and by being fantasy lovers. Unhappy wives, foolish girls who wanted the romance of a mysterious admirer, lonely women who craved the warmth of a lover, even if that lover came to them only in dreams. They were all prey to the incubi. For 5 years, he and Teaser had rented adjoining rooms at an expensive bordello and trolled the den. Then, when he turned 20, Sebastian could no longer ignore a growing need for something beyond the den and sexual games, and he walked away from the colored lights and the dark buildings. He found a dirt lane that began a few steps away from where the den's main street ended, a lane he was certain he hadn't been there before. He followed it, not sure if he was just taking a walk or really leaving the one place he'd felt at home. That was how he found the 2-story cottage. It didn't look like it belonged in a landscape like the den, but it wouldn't have been there if it hadn't belonged. That was the way things worked in ephemera. He went inside, wary of being caught by whoever laid claim to the place, but it wasn't inhabited. Half the rooms were empty, but there was enough furniture left haphazardly in the other rooms to set up a comfortable bedroom, living room, and kitchen. He found linens and towels, as well as everything he needed in the kitchen to prepare and eat a simple meal. He prowled the rooms for an hour and realized something inside him had relaxed, as if he'd taken his first full breath in months. Finding cleaning supplies in a cupboard in the kitchen, he dusted, polished, swept, and scrubbed until the cottage was clean and the furniture arranged to his liking. Then he went back to the den, removed most of his possessions from the room he rented in the bordello, and moved into the cottage. A week later, when he returned from trolling the dense streets, he discovered someone had planted a moonflower beside the cottage's back door. That was when he realized this place had been waiting for him to find it, to want it. She should have known the moment something in him had changed enough to match the cottage, and the moonflower was her way of saying welcome. In ephemera there were few secrets of the heart, and nothing could be hidden from Gloriana Belladonna. He had lived in the cottage for the past 10 years, still a part of the den, and yet apart from it. "Didn't see you around yesterday," Teaser said, pulling Sebastian back to the present. "Just thought I'd stop by and see." He'd spent yesterday sketching, and had burned all the sketches when he realized he'd been trying to capture daylight memories of Aurora, his Aunt Nadia's home village. Things he'd seen as a child during the time he lived with her. Then his father, Koltak, would show up again and take him away, dumping him on some woman in the poor section of the city where Koltak lived, a woman who was paid to tolerate his presence and provide him with food and a place to sleep. Half the time he lived on the streets, running wild with other abandoned children, and remembering all over again how barren and miserable his life was supposed to be. Then Nadia would arrive and take him back to her home. Nadia's and Koltak's battle of wills, and the cycle of loving acceptance and cold-hearted misery, finally ended when he'd gotten away from his father the last time Koltak arrived at Nadia's house to take him back to the hated city. "I was preoccupied," Sebastian said, pushing aside the memories. Teaser grinned wickedly. "Still offering comfort to aging spinsters and lonely widows? You need to look for something a bit more lively, someone with a bit more kick. I can't imagine any of them are much fun when you cross over to give them a ride in the flesh instead of just romantic dreams." Then he sniffed the air. His eyes widened. "Is that coffee?" Sebastian sighed. He'd ground enough beans for 2 cups. Looked like he was going to share. "Come on, then." When he walked back to the counter, Teaser was right behind him. After eyeing the bag of kofia beans, the grinder, and the perk pot, Teaser whistled. "Got the whole setup. Maybe giving spinsters and widows sweet dreams and hot nights is more lucrative than I thought." He paused. "But you don't usually buy from the black market." Sebastian took another mug from the wooden stand and filled it with coffee. "I didn't get this from the black market. This was a gift from my cousins." And he turned to hand the mug to Teaser. He caught the flash of fear in the other incubus's eyes, noted by the slight tremble in the hands that accepted the mug. The prissy prig humans in other landscapes called the incubi and succubi vile demons, although enough of those humans craved the kind of sex that could be had only with an incubus or succubus partner to provide the den's residents with a good living. But there were more dangerous demons that roamed their world, and the incubi and succubi could end up being prey as easily as any human. It had taken him a few years to realize the reason other demons who came to the den were wary of him wasn't because he was a badass demon, it was because of his human connection. They didn't fear Lee, who was a bridge with a rare ability to impose one landscape over another. But Gloriana, no demon wanted to incur her wrath, because Gloriana Belladonna was the landscaper who had created the den of iniquity. Filling his own mug, Sebastian leaned against the counter, sipped his coffee, and said nothing. After a few minutes, Teaser said, "This place, it's nice." He looked at the small table tuckered against the wall, where Sebastian ate his meals, then at the larger table in the dining room. "It looks nice." It looks human, Sebastian thought, feeling as if he'd been caught doing something lewd in public. In a human landscape, since doing something lewd in the den was commonplace. Embarrassed that anyone had seen the evidence of his need to stay connected with whatever humanity he might claim, he felt the old bitterness well up inside of him. Nadia wasn't bloodkin. She'd been married to his father's and had no reason to fight with Koltak over the well-being of a half-demon boy. But she had fought, and had won often enough that there were islands of time throughout his childhood when he'd known what it was like to be loved and accepted. Everything good that he had experienced in the human landscapes had come to him because of her. That was why the cottage had tugged at him. That was why it looked like a human home instead of an incubus's lair. He used the room at the bordello for the seduction. This place reminded him of how he had felt when he lived with Nadia and Gloriana and Lee, when he'd still had some connection with the light. But if the other incubi and succubi had found out he lived like a human, the malicious teasing would never end, and he'd end up being an outcast again. He swallowed the last of his coffee to choke the bitterness back down. "Why are you here, Teaser?" he asked gruffly. Teaser drained his own mug, started to set it aside, then hesitated, crossed the kitchen, and carefully placed the mug in the sink, as if keeping the cottage tidy were of the utmost importance. When he turned back to face Sebastian, his expression was bleak. "We found another one." Currents of power dance through ephemera. This living, ever-changing world. Some of those currents are light, and some are dark. Two halves of a whole. Nothing has one without some measure of the other. That is the way of things. There is no vessel for focusing the light and the dark that can compare to the human heart. How do we tell other people who are still shaken by the horrors the eater of the world set free in ephemera that this thing they fear cannot be destroyed completely because it was manifested from the darkest desires of their own hearts? How can we tell them they planted the seeds of this war that shattered the world? How can we tell them it was their own despair during this fearsome time that changed rich farmland into deserts? How can we tell them that, even with our guidance and intervention, the link between ephemera and the human heart is unbreakable, and the world around them is nothing more or less than a reflection of themselves? We can't tell them, because, despite the dangers that exist within it, the human heart is our only hope of restoring ephemera someday. Nor can we let people completely deny the part they play in the constant shaping and reshaping of this world. So we will teach them this warning. Let your heart travel lightly, because what you bring with you becomes part of the landscape. The Lost Archives.